Hey there, we are looking at the Louisiana Real Estate Purchase Agreement, the Louisiana Real Estate Commission's Purchase Agreement, page 4. And so let's take a look at it. Let me share my screen and we'll go into page 4. So here we are, page 4. We just finished off page 3. Next, remember the information on the top line, property address and date. So line 101, the appraisal process. So there's 2 boxes here and a couple blanks to fill in. So is the sale conditioned upon the property being appraised? Typically, if it's a cash sale, this is something that the buyer can choose or not choose. If it is, if the purchase is going to involve financing, the lender is typically going to require an appraisal be done. So ask your client, and if you want to confirm with the lender whether there's one that would be required or not, just to know, then do that. But typically, I would have my buyers right to condition the sale on the appraisal. So if they don't want to do an appraisal, you can check this box. If they do, then I would check the corresponding box over here that says this sale is conditioned upon the appraisal of the property being not less than the sale price. So the appraisal value has to be higher than the sale price on the purchase agreement. The seller agrees to provide utilities and access for appraisals. Understand that if you're representing the seller or even the buyer, make sure that the utilities are going to be on if the appraiser goes out. If they're not, and the appraiser has to go back to check on something afterwards, a second visit, there's going to be an additional charge. So protect your buyer, make sure the utilities are on, check with the listing agent, make sure the utilities are on. And that includes, power, water, gas. Those are the main 3, but just be sure that they are on before the appraiser goes out. If the appraised value of the property, so right here, if the appraised value of the property is equal to or greater than the sale price, then the buyer shall pay that sale price agreed upon prior to the appraisal. So whatever's on the purchase agreement, that's the price they would pay if it comes in over it. If the appraised value is less than the sale price, then the buyer shall provide the seller with a copy of the appraisal within, I usually put 3 days. So the buyer will provide the seller with a copy of the appraisal within 3 days, right here, of receipt of the same, along with the buyer's written request for the seller to reduce the sale price. So this is saying that if the price comes in, if the appraisal comes in below the contract price, then the buyer shall provide the seller a copy of the appraisal and a written request to reduce the price to the I'm going to say appraisal value. That would be typical. So the next sentence talks about within X number of days. So let's say another 3 days, within 3 calendar days after the seller receipt of the documentation we talked about above, the appraised value, the buyer shall have the option to pay the sale price. So after the 3rd day, the seller has looked at all this. After the 3rd day, the buyer has the option to pay the sale price agreed upon in the original contract before the appraisal was done, or to void this agreement unless the seller agrees in writing to reduce the sale price to the appraised value. And that would be the written request, the buyer's written request up here. Let me highlight this right. So the buyer's written request to the seller, for the seller to reduce the sale price. And so going back down here, it says that the buyer could avoid the purchase agreement unless the seller agrees in writing to reduce the sale price to the appraised value, or all parties agree to a new sale price. There could be some meeting in the middle if you want, and the buyer pays a little bit more and the seller doesn't get quite as much, but there could be some other agreement. So it's either the seller can agree to reduce it to the appraised value, or there's some other meeting of the minds on a new price somewhere else in the middle, I guess. So remember that these things have to happen. Once the buyer receives notification that it's below, the appraisal comes in low, then they have to send the appraisal and a written request to reduce the price to the seller. Once the seller receives it, after the 3 days or a certain number of days, the buyer has the option to pay the original price or void the agreement unless the seller, so the buyer can't just void the agreement. If the seller does agree to pay, reduce the price, then all parties are moving towards a sale. If the seller doesn't want to reduce the price, then the buyer does have the option to back out and move on. Okay. We could probably discuss that all day long. So the next thing here, deposit. We're going to talk about the deposit. Upon acceptance of this offer or any attached counteroffer. So once you have a final contract with everybody's signature, fully executed, original offer, counteroffers, etc. The buyer and the seller and the buyer shall be bound to all terms and conditions of this agreement, and the buyer and or buyer's agent shall deliver within 72 hours. Please make a note of this. Upon the notice of acceptance of the offer, the buyer's deposit in the amount of, so within 72 hours of acceptance of the contract, the buyer or the buyer's agent shall deliver a deposit in the amount of, put it here, and I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to say $1,000, and I'm going to come back to that. And it could be more depending on, it could be more. Certainly the higher the deposit, the more confidence the seller's going to have in your buyer, and it may win them a deal over somebody else's deal that's similar, with no deposit. So it's strategies here. We can talk about those kind of strategies, all day long. So in this first blank on 112, you're going to put $1,000, and then you come down to be paid in the form of, you're here to be paid in the form of, and however it's done, we don't handle cash. So I would not be using that. They would have to go get some type of money order or something. Typically it's a check, and you would put $1,000 in here, numerical reference up to $1,000, and that gets delivered to one of the brokers. So on line 117, the deposit shall be held by the listing broker or the selling broker. So remember, in this case, my scenario was I'm the buyer's agent. So I'm the selling agent, if you will. So because I'm the selling agent, I'm going to check off that the selling broker is going to hold it. And the reason why is simply I can bring the check to my office and have it processed by the broker, just like the listing broker is going to process it. So there's no difference between the two brokers because they're both held to the same standards and rules of the Louisiana Real Estate Commission. So it doesn't matter which broker holds it. It's just I don't have to drive anywhere when my broker holds it. I just go to my office as normal, turn it in, and have it processed that way. And when it's time to go to closing, I just make sure we have it. I bring it to closing and turn it over to the title attorney so he can process it with the sale at the closing. So keep that in mind if you're trying to be wise with your time. As the buyer's agent, I just want to have it held with my broker. The other option here is a third party. I don't like the third party because if you read the documentation that goes with the third party information down here, what you realize is that the Louisiana Real Estate Commission does not have authority over third parties. Therefore, I don't know how it's going to be handled. How are they going to decide if we have a dispute? How does it get handled? what are their processes, all of that. I don't understand that. I don't need to understand every title company or third party's procedures. I just need to know if one of the two licensed brokers holds it, the state has some specific rules and regulations for them to follow. And that is something I can get behind and explain when necessary. So I don't typically use the deposit to be held by a third party. If you do, be sure you read this. And as a result of leaving it in a third party's hands, you're going to have to use an addendum, deposit addendum to the Louisiana Residential Agreement to Buy or Sell, and it explains to your clients the deposit held by the broker, what happens, and a deposit held by a third party, and who knows what happens. So your clients, and then you would put in here, let's say it's ABC Title Company, you would put in here ABC Title so that everyone knows how it can be held and who's going to hold it, and then everybody signs off on it below, and that becomes attached in the purchase agreement. Again, when we attach addendums, remember I showed you down here on page 9, there are these boxes. So there's a place right here for the deposit addendum. If you're going to do a third party, you need to check this box so that the deposit addendum is attached and make sure everybody signs it. Okay, so let's run back up to the next section here. Page 4. Okay, so we were here. I think that's enough discussion about third party. I'm not in favor of it. I would rather it be held by a broker that's governed by the Louisiana Real Estate Commission. All right, so the next paragraph comes in 138. We start talking about what happens to the deposit. When can the deposit be returned? So let's go through number 1. If the agreement is declared null and void by the buyer pursuant to the due diligence and inspection period. So if during the inspection period, the buyer decides their rights and they decide to cancel the purchase agreement within the due diligence period, then the deposit will be returned to the buyer. Number 2, if the agreement is subject to the buyer's ability to obtain a loan and cannot be obtained, basically, if the buyer is denied for a loan and they put forth a good faith effort to get the loan, then they should be entitled to their deposit to be returned. Number 3, if the seller declares the agreement null and void for failure of buyer to comply with a written documentation, written requirements set forth. You remember we talked about the written authorization from the lender that the buyer gave the lender approval to move forward with the loan process. That letter that the buyer is supposed to provide to the seller, that's what this is talking about. If the buyer does not provide that letter to the seller in the time frame specified, then the seller can declare the purchase agreement null and void. The seller has that option, and they would need to do that in writing, and it can be anytime after those dates, after those days that were specified expire. We had talked about putting 7 days in that blank to allow the buyer to do a little shopping with their lender and then get their letters from that lender, written authorization that they were telling them to move forward with their loan process. All right, so the next thing is 4. If the buyer conditions the sale on an appraisal and the appraisal is less than the sales price, and the seller will not reduce the price as set forth in those lines, and a new price is not agreed to, then the buyer has the right to cancel the agreement and get their deposit back. So we talked about that a second ago. Moving on to number 5, if the buyer terminates after receiving lease or assessment documentation. So actually down here, this talks about the seller providing within 5 calendar days information on leases that are in place and or special assessments that are in place. The buyer has the right to read those, check those out, and approve those. And if the buyer does not agree with the terms of these other documents that are in place, then the buyer has the right to cancel the purchase agreement after reviewing those things. So there are some time frames. Remember, I kind of covering this together, but you know, the seller has to provide within 5 days, and the buyer has to declare within 5 days if they're going to move forward or not based on their reading of those documents. So don't waste time. If the seller is unable to deliver the buyer an approved sewer or water inspection report, and if it's required, and that would be typically required by a document, an addendum set attached to the purchase agreement. So we'll show you that document in just a second. So the seller can't deliver the buyer an approved sewer inspection report. And then also these other 2 lines have to do with these same thing, sewer and water. So if the seller chooses not to repair or replace, so that addendum says the seller will repair or replace the sewer system up to a certain amount. And I'm going to go over this addendum in a second. So let's say it's, you know, $3,000. If the seller cannot do that, cannot repair or replace according to that addendum, meaning it's more than the $3,000 specified, then the buyer has the right to terminate. So the seller can't deliver an inspection report, or they can't replace or repair based on the amount of money that was allocated in the blanks on this addendum. And the same thing applies with the water. So those are 2 issues that you need to be aware of. If you have a MODAD or a sewer system on site, or you have well water, this addendum needs to be attached. So here's that addendum. Louisiana Residential Agreement to Buy or Sell, Private Water Sewer Addendum. Basically read through here. If I were going to fill this out and I had the septic tank and a water inspection, I would check right here, and I would in the case the seller agrees to have 1 septic tank that services the primary residence, and you go down to repair or replace the system, as long as the cost to repair or replace the system does not exceed, put a number here. I will tell you, if you put a number like 500, that's probably not enough to even pump it out, much less get something fixed. This number, if you had to replace, typically you had to replace an old sewer system with a new system, you're looking at anywhere from $4 to $6 grand. So I probably would at a minimum put $4,000 here. You really don't know, but it's at least, by adding this document, the seller is agreeing to fix this up to a certain amount. It puts into place what's going to happen if the system does not pass inspections and it's required to be repaired or replaced. At least there's some agreement ahead of time that the seller will do something up to a certain sum. So please use this document when you have those situations with these sewer and water systems, and put a number that's reasonable. Again, $4,000 here would be reasonable to me if it had to be completely replaced. And then on the private water, same thing. You're going to check this box, and then you're going to put in how many systems they have. That hopefully it's just 1 water system, but whatever. And then how much to fix it. I don't really have a suggestion here. I would say that you're probably looking, $1,000, to have some repair made. what if the pump motor went out and it has to be replaced and then it has to be reprimed and stuff like that? $1,000 is probably a good number. And if it's more than that, then the seller has the option to either go ahead and do it or not do it. And if the buyer has the right to back out. So that's the form that you would use. Again, private water sewer addendum. All these forms are located in MLS docs and throughout your DocuSign folders and stuff like that. So that brings us to the end of the deposit, return of the deposit. We covered the lease and special assessments. And I'm going to just say something real quick about new home construction, because we'll do the next video. We'll pick up with the due diligence and inspection period. New home construction addendum. If you have a new home and the builder has an additional document that they have most of their terms outlined on, then you would fill out the Louisiana Residential Purchase Agreement, this document we're looking at. You would check this box and then you would add the builder's addendums to this, so that they become one document. All right, that's really all I have to say about the new home construction paperwork. Next video, we'll pick up on line 177. We'll pick up on property condition. Thank y'all, and see you next.